Greetings everyone, Jerry Carvassier with Lightroom Workshop. Lightroom 4 Develop Module, Local Corrections. Okay, I'm in the Library module here and I've targeted a folder called 24-Hour Local Correct. I'm going to select all the images associated with that, so I'm going to get back to the grid, G for grid. I'm going to select all of the images within the folders. Two folders, one for landscape and one's for people. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run these previews out at 1:1. So basically I'm going to render 1:1 previews for all the images that I'm going to work with in the develop module. Instead of having to import the images at 1:1 and holding on to all that data associated with large JPEGs, I'm just going to render these quickly. When I utilize the develop module, things will go a lot quicker. Okay, so in working with images associated with Lightroom, I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. We're going to bring up a couple of images here associated with a bike race. Now, in the Develop module, we can look and check out what we call over here in the histogram area. Let me bring this up for you. Over here in the histogram we have a little bit of a spike here, and we have what these two little icons at the upper left and upper right, and they're called clipping indicators. Okay, so to enable and disable it, just hit the J key on the keyboard, J for Jerry. That works pretty well. And what that does is that's going to allow us to see these red areas. Those are clipped highlights in this image here. And so the local correct feature here, I'm thinking, is maybe moving to the histogram and pulling that histogram down, or just moving to the basic control panel and say, give me those highlights and bring them to the left. Now we're working with version 4 here, so everything to the left gets darker and everything to the right gets lighter. Okay, so I'm just bringing down the highlights associated with that lycra. Okay, and you can see the blue areas here in the image. Those are areas without detail in the shadows. Okay, so what we're going to do on that side is we're going to bring the blacks up until we start to see some detail present itself. Now you may not be able to pull it out all the way completely, but it can be helpful in bringing down that detail. Okay, so aesthetically it doesn't look so bad. It's black lycra. Okay, so turn off the indicators, turn on the indicators, you can see, and then you can move to the other information here associated with the shirts. We can look at the red indicator here for highlights, and notice that I've dialed down the highlights a bit. So here we go, we're bringing them down just a little bit. Okay, now we'll take a look at this as a rather busy image, and then we'll talk about how to locally correct it more effectively later. But let's move to this title bar right here. Under the histogram, we'll see a title bar that includes the crop tool and what we call the sensor spot removal tool, red eye reduction, and the gradient and the brush tool. Okay, so to get to the crop tool quickly, I'm going to move to this image over here, and I'm moving from my film strip, highlighting images here, and I'm going to move the left panel out of the way so that we can see our image. So the crop tool is an interesting tool for locally correcting your image, and an easy way to get to it from anywhere in the develop module is that you can hit the R key in the keyboard, crop. Okay, so let's just review the tools up here at the top. Crop tool, and notice that each of these tools has its own window shade. Okay, and we'll talk extensively about each of these window shades. If we hit the reset button at the very bottom right, that will reset everything, all the instructions associated with anything that we've done in the develop module. Whereas if we want to, let's say, create a crop and then hit reset within the crop window shade here, or the crop panel, it's just resetting the crop tool itself, not the whole image. Okay, Just a couple super user tips as we head on into working with the raw converter here in Lightroom. And basically, I'm going to close out and move to the basic adjustments here for a second and move to the exposure. I'm going to bring the exposure down here because I need to show you a few things in the crop tool, some guidelines and so forth, and they're best seen when I take down the exposure just a little bit. Now, super user tip here is that if you double click on the word exposure, okay, notice that it zeroes out. So if I were to make a series of adjustments associated with this image, notice that I've made 4 or 5 different adjustments, very drastic adjustments in this case. But in a non-linear fashion, to take out the exposure adjustment, I double click on the word exposure. Take out the contrast adjustment, double click on the word, rather than hitting reset and having to regenerate all of my adjustments. So let's hit reset, brings everything to 0 and null, and I'm going to bring down the exposure just a little bit before I enter the crop tool. Okay, so anybody who has commitment issues associated with making adjustments in Lightroom, understand that when you hit the reset tool, boom, it's gone. All of your adjustments are gone. So you can start from ground zero again. Or if you work in a nonlinear fashion where you create multiple adjustments and you want to take that specific adjustment out, you can easily double click on the word. On the other way too, I mean, there's 2 ways to skin the cat here. You can double click on the triangle or teardrop as well, and that does the same thing. Okay, so let's head back to the crop tool here. I'll close down the basic panel and move to the crop tool, and it draws down its window shade. So basically we have in the crop tool, we have a few of these what we call compositional helpers. Okay, and compositional helpers allow us to, let's say in this case, use the rule of thirds. So if we move through the O key, just by toggling the O key, you can see some of the other compositional helpers associated with the crop tool. So in this case, the rule of thirds is 2/3 in front, 1/3 in back, or vice versa. And maybe some intersecting points where areas of interest. Okay, now this particular horizon line is a problem. Okay, so there is an angle tool. It's right here, and if I click on the angle tool and I use the slider, I can modify and maybe line up the grid. Okay, another way to do it, and quite easily, I'm going to hit reset again on the tool, is to draw with the leveler. Okay, and so if I'm going to move across the screen, I can do that quite easily. Let me just take this adjustment out so you can see what's going on here. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to move to the angle tool. So I'm activating the leveler, moving outside the image, clicking the mouse once, dragging across the screen. I'm telling Lightroom what the angle is, and I let go and it moves it to 0. Okay, so the attribute of the crop tool is to then double click to let it be so, and that will enable the crop instruction. Now you're never committed to the instruction or the crop. You can have multiple crops, and we can create a variety of different crops associated with the crop tool as well. So once I straighten the horizon, I could come over here to the lock feature. Okay, unlock the feature, and I could make an independent crop. Okay, something like that. See, as I grab a handle, I can just move the information around. Okay, now if I want to keep it in an aspect ratio, I can pull this little menu down, itty bitty double arrows here. I'm going to click on here and say 1:1. If I want to make a square image, okay, that's a square image, 1:1 aspect ratio. If I wanted to work with, let's say, a 4:5 or an 8:10 aspect ratio, or if I wanted to go to the 16:9, which would represent what? The HD TV, if I'm doing a bunch of crops to create a slideshow in Lightroom that I can then export out as a video and play on my DVD, that's pretty cool. Excuse me, on my HD TV, that's pretty cool. I could have a cocktail party, and we could have all the HD TVs in the house screening our trip to Burma or Italy or something like that. So that's kind of cool. So double click on the interior of the frame, crop is enabled, and we're ready to go. Good to go. Okay, let's move to another image here quickly. Okay, one of those quartz timing issues where I've got the guy flying through the image and I'm taking a picture of a red barn. But notice the power line at the top. Okay, move to the crop tool, take off the lock, because by taking off the lock it's not locked into the aspect ratio of the frame as it was photographed. So I come over here and click on the padlock, and I'm then can do a independent crop. So if I click out and just move the power line out of the way, works pretty well. Now if I move outside the frame, notice the double arrow. Isn't that cool? Double arrow represents the ability to rotate the image. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll physically click and hold the mouse button down, and I can rotate the image outside of the frame. Sometimes it's great, you might want to create a dynamic line within an image and so forth. So potentially it has a lot of good information. Okay, and again, double click to let it be so. Oops, I missed a little bit. Return to the crop tool, grab the handle, double click to let it be so, and it's okay. This image could use a little bit of adjustment. Okay, it's a raw image, and so the raw file processing, I can increase. I'm going to use the vivid calibration here in camera calibration. So let's do that. Boom. Excellent. We can move on. Don't have to spend a lot of time with this image. I just enhanced it with the saturation associated with camera calibration. Another time, another tool, but really an interesting way to quickly correct an image and move on. Okay, moving on to the next tool up here is the spot removal tool. Okay, and the spot removal tool in the toolbar here represents spot removal. Okay, we've got a couple of features for the brush. We can have it in a clone attribute, or we can have it in a heal attribute. We can control the size of the spot and the opacity of the spot. So I'm not a big fan of the fact that it's only working with spots, but what you have to understand is that Photoshop is the ultimate retouch tool. So the reality is that if you want to do image restoration, Photoshop is the way to go. This will take care of sensor spots or small freckles and moles, those types of things. So if we were to move to this image quickly, and I've got my clipping indicator on, hit J, that'll take away the clipping indicator. And I'm going to zoom into this woman's face, and she has a little freckle here. So if we use the spot removal tool, we could then control the size of the artifact. Okay, so make the brush the size of the artifact. And in this case here, I'm just going to come down just like this and let Lightroom do the work. So if I click once, there it goes, it's gone. I'm going to hit the H key on the keyboard to hide it. There it is, it's gone. Now, all I did was click the mouse button once. I could come up with other information associated with, well, I want to increase the spot from this area. Notice I can create a new spot, okay? But 90% of the time, Lightroom is going to look around the image and work for me in creating the information associated with removing that spot. Now I can use some of the attributes associated with the size relationship, okay? And I can use some of the attributes associated with the opacity, okay? So the clone attribute is an actual sample and replace. The heal attribute, on the other hand, is a sample and blend. So making dark pixels light and light pixels dark, I think, is the analogy that I would use in describing the heal version versus the clone version. So if I come over here, there's another spot. Notice the size of the artifact. Click once, it's gone. Lightroom sampled an area around the artifact and did the best it could as to cover it up, and I think it does a really swell job. So if I hit the H key again, it will hide the circles, or exiting the tool, the circles will disappear. If I say, well, I'd like to try and do a better job, I can highlight this one, hit the delete key, and watch the puff of smoke. It's gone. Adios. Okay, so again, create the size of the brush, the circle. I'm doing it with the circle wheel on my mouse. You can do it with some gestures. You can do it with moving the slider. You decide what works best for you. And just click once and then walk away. Okay? So the spot removal tool, again, is spot removal. It's not image restoration, it's spot removal. It's great for situations where you might have sensor spot and its coordinate is the same in every image. And we could physically get rid of that spot across multiple images if they're all selected at once. Okay, I'm going to skip the red eye reduction tool, which is this one right here. It's really quite easy to work with. I don't really have an example of red eye right now, but basically you create an elliptical shape associated with red eye, and it only works on red eye, and then you would click the mouse once and it would desaturate the red eye associated with the image information. So moving on, we're going to look at the gradient tool. And the gradient tool is a specific tool for working with graduations across images with density. So I'm going to pick an image to work with initially that might be, we'll go to a people image here first, and I'll grab this image right here of Carlin. So I'm going to go to the develop module, I'm going to zip down, and so in this particular case we can look at the gradient tool and it has a variety of attributes associated with it. Okay, so in working with the attributes, we have exposure adjustment, contrast, highlights, shadows, all the basic adjustments associated with the tools, but we're going to create this in a graduated form. Okay. Also, in addition, in version 4, we have temperature and tint effects associated with the graduate filter, and then we have sharpness and color as well. Now, each of the tools, so in the graduated filter tool, we're dealing with 13 components or properties associated with the filter effect. Okay, and so we could use one effect or a series of different adjustments associated with the graduation across the image. So in this particular case here, I think this is a little bit of a bright area on the right hand side of the image, and I could deal with a small graduation of exposure across that image. So notice that I'm tuning up the exposure slider quite heavily. I'm dragging it completely to the right, or excuse me, to the left. And if I click and drag across the image like this, notice that it actually starts to give me a reduction in exposure, but gradually across the frame. Okay, so I can burn down the edge of this piece of adobe sticking out right here on this building, and then have it work more effectively with the image. So let's take a peek at this for a second. If I were to drag the handle all the way across the image like this, I get 100% of the adjustment here, 50% of the adjustment here, and 0 adjustment here. So gradually the effect can be controlled. Now the effect, if I make it a skinny gradient, is a very abrupt change associated with the graduation, whereas if I draw it out, it becomes more gradual. So in this case here, I'm going to gradually draw this out over here and make that adjustment and move on and create a new adjustment for exposure. So this is all dynamic. This is what I love about this tool, is that once I've created the adjustment, the pin represents the activity of the adjustment right now, and so I can move that adjustment up or down like this. Now, if I wanted to use another attribute associated with bringing and working with this image, I could actually go in here and I could actually take the color of this information down by moving the saturation slider to the right. Do you see that? Or to the left, excuse me. So I can either increase it or decrease it, but if I wanted to add just a touch of gray associated with that wall, I can bring it down just like that. So I've got two adjustments associated with this gradient. Now, to create a new adjustment, whereas if I wanted to bring in another graduation from the left this time, I hit the new key, and notice my adjustment from the previous is left over. Even though I'm going to create a new one, I can hit the Option key. Do you see this custom area? It's going to say reset. So if I click it, it zeroes it out, and all of the adjustments are nulled. Okay? Now, I'm going to move to the left-hand part of the screen, and I'm going to start to draw another adjustment down just like this. Now, all I want to do in this case is burn down this shirt just a little bit. You know, Carlin's looking like quite the politician here. You know, he's got the American flag back there, and he's pontificating about some photographic event that he's trying to work with here. Now, there's two adjustments. Notice the pin is active, and so when I access the pin, I can then recreate another adjustment associated with this gradient versus this gradient. I can actually improve or decrease or increase the contrast associated with that adjustment. Now, another adjustment might be to burn down this edge right here. I want to keep the flag predominant within the picture, and so I'm going to come over here and create a new adjustment by clicking on the word new. I can then start a new adjustment from the bottom of the screen. So I'm just going to bring in just a little bit of an adjustment here. Bring down that exposure there just to darken down here. So in looking at this image, the focus of the image is now on Carlin speaking. Okay, so if I hit the done button, okay, and if I take a look at the before and after, oops, that's the wrong before. I was working with an antique view earlier, but let's reset. Oh, gosh darn it. So in the graduated filter tool, we're dealing with 13 components or properties associated with the filter effect. Okay, and so we could use one effect or a series of different adjustments associated with the graduation across the image. So in this particular case here, I think this is a little bit of a bright area on the right hand side of the image, and I could deal with a small graduation of exposure across that image. So notice that I'm tuning up the exposure slider quite heavily. I'm dragging it completely to the left. And if I click and drag across the image like this, notice that it actually starts to give me a reduction in exposure, but gradually across the frame. Okay, so I can burn down the edge of this piece of adobe sticking out right here on this building, and then have it work more effectively with the image. So let's take a peek at this for a second. If I were to drag the handle all the way across the image like this, I get 100% of the adjustment here, 50% of the adjustment here, and 0 adjustment here. So gradually the effect can be controlled. Now the effect, if I make it a skinny gradient, is a very abrupt change associated with the graduation, whereas if I draw it out, it becomes more gradual. So in this case here, I'm going to gradually draw this out over here and make that adjustment and move on and create a new adjustment for exposure. So this is all dynamic. This is what I love about this tool, is that once I've created the adjustment, the pin represents the activity of the adjustment right now, and so I can move that adjustment up or down like this. Now, if I wanted to use another attribute associated with bringing and working with this image, I could actually go in here and I could actually take the color of this information down by moving the saturation slider to the right. Do you see that? Or to the left, excuse me. So I can either increase it or decrease it, but if I wanted to add just a touch of gray associated with that wall, I can bring it down just like that. So I've got two adjustments associated with this gradient. Now, to create a new adjustment, whereas if I wanted to bring in another graduation from the left this time. I hit the new key, and notice my adjustment from the previous is left over. Even though I'm going to create a new one, I can hit the Option key. Do you see this custom area? It's going to say Reset. So if I click it, it zeroes it out, and all of the adjustments are nulled. Okay? Now, I'm going to move to the left-hand part of the screen, and I'm going to start to draw another adjustment down just like this. Now, all I want to do in this case is burn down this shirt just a little bit. You know, Carlin's looking like quite the politician here. You know, he's got the American flag back there, and he's pontificating about some photographic event that he's trying to work with here. Now, there's two adjustments. Notice the pin is active, and so when I access the pin, I can then recreate another adjustment associated with this gradient versus this gradient. I can actually improve or decrease or increase the contrast associated with that adjustment. Now, another adjustment might be to burn down this edge right here. I want to keep the flag predominant within the picture, and so I'm going to come over here and create a new adjustment by clicking on the word New. I can then start a new adjustment from the bottom of the screen. So I'm just going to bring in just a little bit of an adjustment here. Bring down that exposure there just to darken down here. So in looking at this image, the focus of the image is now on Carlin speaking. Okay, so if by hitting the Done button, I disengage the tool down here in the toolbar. So if we return back to the same image and activate the gradient filter again, you can hit the M key on the keyboard. Notice that it pulls down the window shade, and then we're back into the adjustment. Now, instead of hitting Reset, which would wipe out all of these adjustments, and I wanted to look at the before and after associated with the adjustments that I've made within the gradient filter, there's a small little light switch down here. It's really difficult to see, but there it is. It's right off there. I can turn on and off the gradient filter just by moving that light switch up or down. So I think it improved the image, gave it a bit more continuity, and the ability to kind of draw our attention on the speaker in this case. Let's take a look at another image associated with the gradient tool in a portrait situation as well. So I'll move to Genevieve, and we'll bring up the situation here is that her face is rather bright, but also this background area is very bright too. So we've got two competing highlights in this image associated with working and viewing what's going on here. So the gradient filter can do a wonderful job here again in focusing our attention. So in this case here, I'm going to go over here to the left hand side of the screen, and I'm going to draw a gradient across the screen and then across her face. What I physically want to do is reduce this highlight on the left hand side by drawing down the exposure, so more of the concentration is on Genevieve. Okay, and I might want to emulate the effect of the late afternoon sun. So if I go down here to the color patch, which is right here, little color patch, if you click on it, what it does is it displays the color picker, and I could pick a yellow, and notice how it warms up that information coming across that screen. So by applying a few more gradients associated with burning down the edges and so forth, I can easily create a new one and move, let's say, into this corner and draw down the exposure here. I'm just doing a little bit of what we call a burn. Okay, and if I create a new one, I can come off here and draw another one that draws down the information on this side gradually. And so now again, the focus is to work with, creating that effect of the late afternoon sun. Going to warm up each one of these gradients with a little bit of yellow, and that helps to kind of work with that effect. Okay, so let's take a peek. Let's see if it really improved this image by focusing our attention on her versus the background. So the reality is I'm not committed to any one of these three gradients, but I can, if I'm looking, can highlight this pin and readjust that information associated with the exposure. I can bring it down or bring it up just to modify it, just like this. Now, if we look up here, there's a small little triangle. Again, they make these things so small. But if I click on this triangle, notice that it takes the effect and creates an amount slider. So I can just then, if I had combinations of different gradients, I could then control the amount of the gradient by moving it to the left or the right. So notice what happens. See, I can just kind of tune it up from here as well. So just another little slider to help you in the process of working with your information. Now, if I click on the triangle again, that brings down the window shade with all the adjustments associated with it. And now that I have this one active, okay, I could actually control the tint as well. I could actually increase the yellow even more in each one of these using the temperature slider, okay? And so moving to the temperature slider, instead of the color, I'm taking the color and increasing the temperature of that color. So there we go. Nice job of increasing and decreasing areas of the image with the gradient tool. Now, where the gradient tool really comes into play is with the landscape. Wonderful feature associated with landscape. So I'm going to hit the grid. I'm going to access the painted desert image here and move back to the develop module. So D for develop, and it brings up this image in the develop module. So I'm going to go to the gradient. And in this case here, the sky, I'd like to really bring down the sky in a gradient, and I'd like to expose the information in the foreground as well. So in this particular case here, I'm going to grab a new gradient, and if I start to draw the gradient down, so let me just add a little bit of adjustment to the gradient. So notice I've got a little bit out of control. If I hit the delete key, that eliminates the gradient. So in working with this, I'm going to again bring down that exposure extremely heavy, and I'm going to click and hold the mouse button down and then drag down through the image. Now, you see it wobbling a bit, okay? So if you hold the shift key down as a modifier, it straightens it right up, okay? See that? And I can drag down the information just like this. So I'm going to create this gradient. I don't want it to be so abrupt. I want it to be gradual across the sky, and I let go. Now, again, I can tune it up in any way, shape, or form just by moving my exposure slider and maybe increase the contrast a little bit. And I could then maybe increase the saturation level of the blue. Okay, so nice going here. Okay, it's doing a good job. And the next piece is to work with the foreground area. Again, I have to go to the new button right here, and I have to click on it to create a new gradient. Okay, so I'll click here, and I'll start my gradient from the bottom. And again, the gradient's dark because the leftover adjustment from the last gradient I created. Now, again, too dark, but what it's doing is it's helping me to see the placement of the gradient. Now again, the wobble. Okay, correct for that by holding down the shift key. And now I can adjust the exposure to increase the area in the foreground. In a combination this time, I might use some clarity to give some of the landform a bit of detail. Okay, that's kind of cool. And then I might use a color again. I might either use the temperature and make it a bit warmer in the foreground, okay, to complement that blue sky. And so there I have it. I've really kind of improved this image quite dramatically with a few clicks on the gradient tool. Okay, excellent. We can work with a variety of other landscapes as well. Okay, this looks a little bit on the light side to start with, and so what I can do is I could go to the basic adjustment first. Okay, hit my basic adjustment, maybe increase the contrast, maybe a little bit too much. Bring down the highlights just a little bit, and bring down the shadows just a hair, and increase the blacks kind of like that. Okay, now what I really like to do is to probably bring the sky detail up. Okay, and then I'll actually add a little bit of information to the landform here. But if I move to the gradient tool again, this time, and select new, draw down that gradient from the sky, just like that. Holding down the shift key straightens out that information for me, and I can gradually bring down the gradient and adjust the gradient for the clouds and the saturation, something like that. Okay? Really helps this image, okay, to be able to draw that gradient down. You really don't need that extended range neutral density filter. You know, if it's a raw file, you can easily adjust it in here. Okay? So, gradient tool is quite extensive in really helping you work through a series of images, you know, working to identify areas within the image that you want to increase with color. And again, slider associated with it just to tune it up, okay? You'll be done, and you can move on, okay? Gradient filter, a wonderful tool to work with in your landscapes and portraits, just when you need to be able to gradually make an adjustment across the screen. Okay, so now let's prepare to work with the brush tool. The gradient tool works quite effectively for gradients across the screen, but we want to work more effectively with the brush tool to work with specific areas. Now if we pull down the, I'm just going to move the screen out just a little bit so you can see all the different adjustments here. You can see that with the gradient tool we had all of these adjustments here, but now in addition to those adjustments associated, these 13 right here, we can actually move down here, and then we have what we call brush attributes. So to explain the brush attribute, I'm just going to stay on this screen for a second, and you can see that I have the ability to control the size of the brush that I'm going to use. Okay? And you can see that I have an A and a B attribute. So I'm just going to create some extreme adjustments here so you can see what's going on with my brush attributes. Okay, so if I click once, I have a nice soft adjustment, and as I move across that tool, it's a very feathered edge, and that feathered edge represents that exterior circle. Okay, so if I want to increase the edge, I can hold down the shift key and control the feathering of the brush with my wheel on my mouse, or you can do it with the bracket keys. Left or right bracket keys associated with holding the shift as the modifier can allow you to create the edge of the brush. Okay? To make a very sharp brush, on the other hand, what you can do is you can, come over here and move the slider and take the feathering out completely. But I find the controls associated with moving to the sliders to be not quite as beneficial. So I have two attributes to the brush. I have an A brush and a B brush. So I always use my A brush as the feathered mode. Okay, and let me just back these adjustments out. I'm using the Command Z, Z, Z. Okay, don't go too far back with Command Z, 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 because then you move on to the last image you were working on, and it'll start backing out the instructions associated with those. So toggling the Command Z will give you, will move you back in time, basically. Now, size, the wheel on my mouse, slider over here. Problem with that is that I have to keep moving over here, moving the slider, checking the brush size back and forth. Or left or right bracket keys control the size of the brush on your keyboard. And if you wanted to control the feathering of the brush, you can use the shift modifier and move the bracket keys, or use the wheel on your mouse, or some type of gesture. Okay? Now, I'm always of the opinion that my A brush in my workflow should be a smooth, feathered brush at an efficient size to start with. Okay? If I move to the B brush, I can set up an attribute for the B brush, and in this case the B brush has no feather. So if I click over here, you can see Oops, I have the auto mask turned on. Let me turn that off. You can see that I can create a rather sharp brush that I could paint with. Okay? Painting and adjustment. Okay, now, again, flipping back and forth between the A, just like that. Nice smooth brush. B brush. No feathering. Okay? Now, let's move to the other feature here associated with the brush. It's called flow and density. Don't use those features all that much. Flow would allow me to, if I set it to, let's say 25%, it's 25% of the adjustment. See that? And then I could, by keeping on clicking the mouse, I can control the flow of the adjustment, so I can gradually build up an adjustment with the brush. Kind of like an airbrush. Okay? Now, I always work with that 100% because basically I'm controlling the flow with the adjustment that I create, right? With the slider. And the density is a cap on adjustment. So if I set it to 50%, I can never move that adjustment any more than that 50% of density. Okay, even though I click some more, it's not getting any more information associated with the adjustment. It's capped off at, in this case, about 44. So in my particular workflow, I'm always using the dynamic slider as the flow control. Okay. And when I paint and use the flow, I'm not actually building up density in the adjustment. I'm controlling the density in the adjustment with the slider. Personal preference. If you want to set the flow to 10% and work on clicking the mouse button 10 times to get up to 100% of the adjustment, that's the way it works. Okay. Now, in working with the attribute of what we call the auto mask feature, very cool. Okay, but it only works in situations where you have a well-defined edge. Okay. Now, I'm going to advance the auto mask feature here. I'm going to enable it. Okay, and I have the A and the B brush component, right? So if I flip to the B brush, notice that I don't have any feathering, and so I don't have that exterior circle around my brush. But let's just show you what happens when I click and start to drag across this well-defined edge. The auto flow or auto mask detects the edge and doesn't move over it as long as the crosshair does not cross the defined edge. How cool is this? Okay, basically I could add a little value to the sky, add a bit more saturation, and maybe even a different color if I wanted to. You know, maybe something along the purple side, and then start to move its saturation to a different direction. Okay, very cool. Okay, another example right here. Well-defined edge against the sky. I'm using a sharp brush. I could use a soft brush, it doesn't matter. As long as that little crosshair, as I hold the mouse button down, does not cross that line, it doesn't start to search for another edge. So let's click and drag, and notice that even I can reach into these areas like this and then move across just like that. Okay, detects a well-defined edge. Now the thing about the auto mask feature is it's not real great at finding the edge when you start to deal with, you know, leaves on a tree that are kind of blurry, that are swinging in the wind. Doesn't really help because it's not a well-defined edge. It's a soft edge, and the auto mask feature will not work in those situations. Okay, so in this case here, that sky's white. I had to add some value. I need to add some value associated with working with that area so that I could change its color. Okay, so if I wanted to add some blue and then increase the saturation of that color or move it in a different direction, that's how it's done. Okay, more value, more saturation, that type of thing. Okay, pick a different blue, make it darker, make it pink, late sunset, something like that. Does a good job. Now if I wanted to, notice the well-defined edge associated with this building structure. Okay, this is a little place in Pasadena. It's the high school, so I'm going to click on a new brush. Again, here's my active pin. I'm going to create a new active pin by painting in here. Now you'll notice that, starting to detect an edge in another area. Okay, but secret. Hold down the Option key or the Alt key, and you can, let me use the attribute of the B brush on the eraser. So the eraser, I want to have a no feather. Okay, so I can erase away by holding down the Alt key on the PC, Option key on the Mac, and I can erase away information. Another thing to be aware of is that if I activate the key or the pin and I park my cursor over it, it shows me a red mask. Again, park my cursor over an active area and it shows the red mask. Now I can enable and disable the mask by hitting the O key on the keyboard and paint directly with the mask. Hit the O key again, it turns off the mask. So I'm dealing with a red mask at this point by hitting the O key on the keyboard to enable and disable the mask, or parking the cursor over the target pin and it'll enable the mask. Now look at this. I've got a double arrow when I park the cursor over the target. And so what that means is that if I hold the mouse button down and click and drag to the left or right, notice what happens to my exposure slider, that it moves and readjusts that information. So as long as I have the mouse button down and moving back and forth, it will give me an adjustment to the values that I put in. So if I had multiple values associated with this adjustment, notice that if I park the cursor, all of these sliders are changing. Isn't that cool? Okay, in relationship to the left or right move that I'm making. So let's drive this home one more time with a, I'm going to go to the grid for a second here. I think it's in the Peoples folder, and I have a well-defined edge associated with the interior of the beach box. Okay, looking at this image, I'd go over here, maybe straighten it out a little bit, double click to let it be so, and move to the brush. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my brush. Okay, to do that, I hold the Option or the Alt key down. Notice where it says Effect right here. It will move to Reset. Okay, I'm resetting the brush. Okay, resetting the brush as in the relationship of the adjustments. Everything's zeroed out now. Okay, we've got a well-defined edge associated with the interior of the beach box. And we could actually dodge the beach box. We have a variety of effects filters here that we can work with. In this case here, they actually have a dodge or lighten. Okay, so if I enable that, notice that it just increases the exposure just a little bit. Not enough for me to see the information, so I'm going to reset the tool, holding down the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on the PC. And what I'm going to do in this case here is I'm going to pile up the exposure by more than a stop. And you can see the interior has a well-defined edge here along the beach box. So here I go. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag within the beach box area here and increase it. So I'm going to increase it some more. And ooh, it does a pretty bad job in this guy's chest, okay? But certainly I wouldn't use this adjustment in this particular case here. I would go to reducing that adjustment just to give the interior view something like this, something that's dialed down a little bit. Okay, so when I zoom up, I hit the Z key on the keyboard, and I'm looking at this guy's chest and going, oh man, look at that terrible line. Let's go to the different attribute of the brush. Notice that it is on the feathered edge, and I'm going to move outside the adjustment and hold down the Option key. Okay, and I need to make my feather adjustment for the eraser, and then I can just draw along that edge and draw that information down just by using the feather edge of the brush outside of the adjustment. So let's see what it looks like now. Ooh, nice smooth transition, except for this area right here. So Option key, I'm erasing the adjustment right there. All right. Nice smooth mask. Now if I move to other areas of the image, you can see where it overlapped a little bit maybe. Okay, so if I hit O on the keyboard, let's get rid of that. Option, Alt on the PC, turning my brush to an eraser. Okay. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay. How cool is this, folks? The ability to modify the edge based on working with the image in a selected area. Okay. Now certainly that shadow information, when we roll it up way too high, is going to show a lot of noise, but I only want to look at that information and give people an idea what's the interior, what is that. Okay, that's all I need to do. If I create a new brush and I want to create a different adjustment, let's say over here I want to resaturate this building. Okay, I could go to the effects, hit the Option key, click where it says reset. Okay, and let's increase the saturation, and we'll start to paint over, and oops, I reduced the saturation, sorry. Increase the saturation over here and then start to paint and saturate that building just like that. Saturate the towel, something like that. Okay, notice pin active, pin active. Okay, areas of the mask that we're producing. Not unlike Photoshop when we used to create the adjustment layer masking, spending all our time blurring information and so forth. Now it's all within the brush and easily managed. Okay, so let's take a situation like this where we have, we can take a look at the busy background here. Okay, so earlier we adjusted this image for the highlights, okay, but if we use the brush feature here, we could actually bring it down. So I'll use the A brush with a soft feathered edge. I'll increase the exposure and bring the information down on these guys. Okay, just burning down the edges here in working with the information. Now let's say I want to create a new brush that works with a bit of clarity associated with locally adjusting clarity within the image. I'm kicking up the clarity, knocking down the saturation, zeroing it off. I'll zero out the exposure value and only work with the clarity information here. And as I paint around within this area here, we're increasing the clarity or sharpness within the midtones. Okay. We also have a sharpness, and so I could actually move the sharpness information up just locally within that area. Notice this. Bring it up, bring it down. Bring it up, bring it down. Okay, so let's turn off and on this information to see where we're at and see how we improved this focus of the information within the image. Now if I wanted to then grab another brush, and maybe I want reduced clarity, which would be a diffused effect, and then it could become a creative effect, I could start to move into this area outside of the two gentlemen here and reduce the focus on those areas. Okay, so we've got a series of images here looking at how we might improve those images by just burning down edges just with the brush. Okay, let's move to another image here that we could actually move to create an adjustment. A couple of different ways to look at this information is in this case here, we've got a fella in the outback at one of the sheep stations about outback, and let's reset this brush and increase or decrease the exposure. And I'll come back in, oops, sorry about that. Come back in and with a very big brush, start to burn down some of the background here. And if I make a mistake, what do? I use the whoops, roller bar on my mouse, and I use the Option key and come back here and kind of bring that down. Okay, so I can control how he's looking within the frame, just like I was burning and dodging in the darkroom. And if I want to use a variety of different tools within, let's say, the effects menu here, we can actually move into, let's say, the teeth here and do a little bit of dental work. We can go over here with what we call teeth whitening. Okay, and I can just grab a small brush and just improve that just like that. Okay, get rid of those tobacco stains and so forth. Now, if it looks a little too bright, whoa, way too bright, let's bring it down just to reduce that. And basically what's happening here is it's reduced saturation on that yellow. Okay, now another interesting way to look at this image would be to do the opposite effect. Okay, so I'm going to zoom down and I'm going to create a new brush that represents no saturation. Okay, so basically I'm going to grab a huge brush. Oops, sorry about that. I'm using the roller and I'm just going to paint across this image just black and white. Boom, just like that. Okay, now create a different situation where if I wanted to reveal the red shirt, it would be a matter of holding down the Option key and just painting this by, what am I doing? I'm erasing away my saturation adjustment. So again, you need to zoom in, you need to be able to control your edges, okay? And you need to be able to work with, the information once you grossly change the color and come back and start to work on bringing that shirt in. Okay, I'm going to tell you that if you practice this for 1 hour a day for about 3 days, you'll be quite proficient at the brush. Now, what I have to tell you is that the brush itself is a wonderful tool. And in that it's a wonderful tool, we're able to do a variety of things like dipping the brush into an adjustment and painting with that adjustment. Okay, so in this case here I have increased exposure but black and white, so it's kind of a creative look and feel associated with this image, associated with a friend of mine who's sitting at a piano. Okay, black and white in a color image. Bring out that saturation and we've lightened up the image just like that. All dynamic. Okay, so if we tune up the before and after, we can just kind of turn it on and turn it off, and you can start to see that this is going to create a significant tool for you. Think of having a palette and dipping your brush into each one of these adjustments and painting that adjustment within the environment. Fantastic. In looking at, let's say, portraits versus landscapes, I'm going to go back to the grid here and I'm going to grab the landscapes and I'm going to look at this landform here that we worked on earlier, and let's just use the balloon. That's a nice one to work with. So I'll hit the D key, go to the brush tool, create a very large size brush for the balloon. Okay, notice the feathered brush, feathered edge, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the saturation in the balloon just with a couple of clicks, 2 clicks. Okay, I'm going to burn down the edges of the frame, grab a new brush, bring down the exposure, and start to do this. Okay, just as if I was in the darkroom. Okay, now again the focus is here. My exposure is a bit extreme, okay, but it's all dynamic here. I'm never committed to this or this. I just season it to taste. It's like basting a turkey, folks. Okay, I could bring up the clarity, okay, within the area. Notice that. So there's a combination happening here. Exposure and clarity and saturation all being utilized in the same brush. It's like having the palette and dipping into exposure and dipping into clarity and dipping into saturation and painting with that information within the image. Grab a new brush. In this case here I might boost the clarity. So I'm going to Option click on the word effect and it turns to reset, and I'm going to increase the clarity, and I'm just going to tap on the balloon. Okay, so I've got two adjustments going here. I've got one adjustment for the saturation, and I've got one adjustment for the clarity. Okay, by seeing the mask, by enabling the O key in the keyboard, you can see where the mask is being drawn. And if you need to erase pieces of the mask which represent the adjustment, you can hold the Option key down, which turns the brush tool into an eraser. Okay, now the auto flow feature or auto mask feature is fantastic, but it's only going to work in areas that have well-defined edges. It's not going to work on hair against a white background that's flowing in a breeze. It's just not that good. But it does have some benefits for a situation like this. If I clicked on the auto mask feature in this case here, and I wanted to just identify the lips in the Luna Park entry out in Sydney, what I can do is I can, let's say I want to just start with an adjustment that reduces the density here. So I'm clicking, I'm painting. Notice the brush enabled with the mask. And so basically I can adjust the red lips. Alright, so let's turn off the mask by hitting the O key. And I can increase or decrease the exposure on the lips. I could increase the saturation associated with the lips, only because the lips have a well-defined edge, okay? And I could boost the clarity and increase the shadows and so forth. So in looking at, using the brush as a tool, it's quite easy, especially with the auto mask feature here. Let's zoom into the eyeball here, just 1 second. Okay, so let's reset the brush. Let's increase the exposure. But in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the auto mask. And when I paint with the brush now, using the exposure adjustment, it will not move over the detected edge. Okay, let's move over to the other eyeball. Notice that it's not moving over the detected edge. So now, oops, ran that cursor just a little bit too far. Okay, again, I'm not moving the crosshair across that edge. But if I zoom down, we can actually see that I've got two adjustments going within the same brush. Okay, one for the lips and one for the eyes. Okay, all right, folks, guaranteed. Spend an hour a day for 3 days with this brush, the gradient tool, the crop tool, and the sensor spot removal or the spot removal brush, and you'll be on your way to moving through your images reasonably quick, as if you were in the darkroom in a previous life. Okay, I'm going to insist again that, when you work with images, you need to have a calibrated monitor. And calibrated monitors are important, especially in the develop process, because as you make the changes associated with the view that you're working with, you need to have the correct brightness, contrast, and color. Okay. Thanks for coming by.